Hello friends, today we shall discuss a framework for DPDPA compliance in the family of DGPSI, which is Data Governance and Protection Standard of India. This particular framework has been specifically fine-tuned for use by a hospital where personal data is being processed. As you are aware, the DGPSI represents a set of frameworks for compliance of DPDPA, started with the DGPSI full version, which had 50 specifications built under 12 principles, included special aspects such as data valuation, distributed responsibility, process-based compliance, DTS for maturity, and the hybrid entity concept, where an organization can be a data fiduciary, significant data fiduciary, and a data processor at the same time. Subsequently, we created a simplified version called DGPSI Lite, meant for SMEs, with 36 specifications, basically covering the requirements of the DPDPA Act, and not including the governance aspects which were there in the DGPSI Full. Because DGPSI Full not only covered DPDPA, it also covered 88-2000. It also covered a data governance draft framework which had been released by BIS. Subsequently, we had created a framework called DGPSI AI, specifically to address the use of AI by data fiduciaries. This was supposed to be used in addition with DGPSI Full. Following this, we created a framework DGPSI HR exclusively for the HR operations, which included aspects such as POSH, RTI, and so on. Then we also created a framework for data processors who intend to be compliant with the DPDPA, though there is no legal mandate for that. We felt that data processors would voluntarily adopt this DGPSI DP as a framework. This had 36 specifications. Subsequently, to extend the DGPSI family to the international requirements, we also created a DGPSI GDPR, which is a framework similar to DGPSI Full, but applied to the principles of GDPR. So this is the background in which DGPSI family of frameworks were present. But when we tried to apply this to the hospital sector, there was one glaring requirement which was staring at our face. So far, we are looking at data as a property which has got a value, which is owned by the data principal, and he licenses the data fiduciary to make use of it based on the consent. This is the basic framework of DPDPA. But when it comes to the hospital, where personal data of patients are used, data has a meaning much more than money. Here, data is life, because if data by any chance in a hospital is available for misuse, then what happens is not just loss of money, but could be loss of life. Therefore, when we try to apply this DGPSI and DPDPA compliance to hospitals, we were finding some kind of difficulties to satisfy the requirements of the sector. Because here, patient safety was paramount. Nothing else was important. And because there can be nothing more sensitive than life, every hospital was to be considered as a significant data fiduciary. So we had to factor in these two things when we are looking at DGPSI application to the hospital. So therefore, in terms of governance, we felt the necessity that the control which law gives to the data protection officer as the sole representative who represents an organization for DPDPA compliance needs some kind of an internal governance adjustments. So therefore, we felt that an organization needs to create what we have called as a CDP triumvirate. That is the CISO and the PSO. PSO is the patient safety officer, which is a designation which is used by hospitals which go for NABH accreditation. CISO, of course, we know that is a general designation for the information security manager who takes care of the entire IT security. Now, DPO has to work closely with these two people, CISO and the PSO, and this team should internally govern the management of the data. Of course, whenever a breach happens, the CISO has to look at it as a data breach, reportable perhaps to the CERT-In. The DPO will look at it as a breach reportable to the Data Protection Board, while the PSO will look at this as a patient safety issue, which may have to be acted upon as per the NABH guidelines. So these were required to come together. And of course, there is also the incidence of AI. And if there is an AI, there may be an AI regulatory officer who perhaps may work directly under CISO. And in case the hospital belongs to public sector, there may be a CPIO. Now CPIO has to work along with the DPO and handle RTI. Of course, when he handles RTI, he handles it independently, just like the DPO handling the DPDPA things independently. But internally, the governance structure has to bring the CISO, DPO, PSO, and the CPIO, and if there is an AI regulatory officer, ARO, everybody together into a team. And we felt that the governance committee, which is suggested under DGPSI full version, which has a representation of all the stakeholders and chaired by the independent director, will be the forum in which all these 4 or 5 people will work together. So this is one of the basic structural differences we wanted to bring into this framework. Otherwise, this framework will use the 18 foundation principles, 12 from DGPSI full, 6 from the AI, DGPSI AI, 59 implementation specifications, 50 from DGPSI full plus the AI specifications, and divided over the 5 responsibility centers. The 5 responsibility centers will be the management, the triumvirate, that is DPO with CISO and PSO, then technology, legal, and HR. So this is the structure of the governance which we wanted to have. If you look at the implementation specifications, the first 15 specifications were meant for the management, and that would include taking the significant data fiduciary posture, applying process-based compliance, having a view on data valuation, having a governance committee, risk awareness amongst the employees, doctors, consultants, etc., and vendors. All these things come under the management responsibilities. The DPO responsibilities include the usual lawful processing, consent management, breach management, consent and of the legacy data, then handling of unstructured data, as well as security. Wherever necessary, the PSO and the CISO will be assisting the DPO. The legal and HR responsibilities are something like the grievance redressal, nomination facility, kind of things fall under the legal contracts, business associate contracts, medical equipment contracts, etc. In the case of HR, there is the management of the employees, plus many of these employees who are, say, doctors, they are actually consultants. They are individually joint data fiduciaries. So there is and they're also very senior. They cannot be handled like any other employee. So these were under the HR. The technology people, of course, will be involved in process inventory, data inventory, pseudonymization, security controls, managing cross-border transfers and AI assurances, and so on. Now, AI in hospital, where hospital is the deployer, I should consider that it has its own duties. That the AI not only should not harm the patients, but also should not harm the society at large, for which they may have to take documented assurances from the licensor, which may include the tamper-proof kill switch, which has been suggested under DGPSI AI, then the critical risk classification of cyborgs and sentient algorithms, humanoid robots, then possibility of including the concept of fading memory. Of course, it has to be used, this concept has to be used very with circumspection in this kind of a scenario, because there are certain things which needs to be remembered over a period of time. But there is always a scope for making some kind of changes, because just as in life, the human body is also capable of getting developing inbuilt defenses, so that an ailment which was there perhaps in the childhood need not necessarily be actually relevant at a later stage, because the body has got adjusted to it, something like that. So the fading memory concept, which is generally a concept which says that just as we allocate priorities in life, where the immediate things are considered more relevant than incidents which have happened years back, the AI should have a weightage for this kind of time value of learning, which is embedded into its methodology. So that is the fading memory concept, which may require a special thinking in the medical sector. Now, AI also should look at, the deployer's duties should look at how AI is used in the organization, and what kind of disclosures we need to make to the data principals, which who are patients in this particular case. So keeping these things in mind, we felt there is a need to have a separate framework called DGPSI-Hospital. In fact, this is not the end of the road. We have in the DGPSI team, they need to build a framework for DGPSI banks separately, DGPSI for educational institutions, and even within the healthcare, apart from the hospital, your diagnostic centers are big enough, and many of the principles which we may use in hospital may or may not be relevant for diagnostic centers. So we may think of having a separate sub-framework for DGPSI diagnostic centers. So in summary, we can say where data is life, compliance is care. DGPSI-Hospital, therefore, thinks differently. It tries to unite DPDPA 88-2000 and NABH patient safety into one governed auditable framework. This is, of course, a new thought, requires validation from the industry, and as we go ahead, we will try to implement it, and perhaps the industry can respond to it as we go on. With the friends, we had an introductory video on the need for DGPSI-Hospital as a framework. And now we will try to continue our discussions into the specific model implementation specifications which we have tried to suggest for DPDPA compliance in a hospital where data, of course, there is data of public, data of the employees, but more importantly, a hospital has personal data of patients, which actually is a data which directly relates to a life and death situation. Therefore, it has to be handled separately. So, DGPSI hospital could be considered as a combination of the patient data management, the hospital employees data management, and any other public data which lands in the hands of the hospital. Now, this 50 model implementation specification has 15 under the management responsibilities, 13 under DPO, 6 under legal, 5 under HR, and 11 under technology. Now let us now look at the management responsibilities, the 15 specifications. Now, the first specification is, of course, the management has to take certain preliminary decisions, one of which is whether the organization is a significant data fiduciary. So the first specification says, considering the risk to human life in hospital operations, treat the hospital as a significant data fiduciary and devise policies accordingly. Where AI is used, take special care that unknown AI risks do not materially affect the hospital's responsibilities. So we will not wait for somebody to designate a hospital as a significant data fiduciary. We will adopt it voluntarily. That is the first management step. Along with that, it is necessary to designate a DPO with necessary credentials, supported with people, budget, technology, and if possible, with external consultancy. Then designate an AI regulation officer in case of the use of AI. This AIRO will be responsible for ensuring AI usage in different processes to ensure that it does not materially affect healthcare functions. And he works closely with the DPO, PSO, and CISO, covering AI used by the organization and also by its vendors and associates. The management will also have to create a 3-member compliance team, DPO, CISO, and PSO together to continuously supervise compliance with DPDPA, ITA 2000, as well as NABH accreditation. Each of these people will be facing their respective regulators externally, while internally they will be coordinating with a common goal of patient safety. Now, if the hospital is a public authority, they will be liable for RTI. Therefore, they need to have a CPIO who works closely with the DPO. Then it is the responsibility of the organization to establish policies for harmonious functioning of DPO, CISO, PSO, CPIO, as well as AIRO, so requirements under different statutes are respected and managed effectively. This is the first implementation specification suggested under the DGPSI hospital. The second implementation specification is related to Data Governance and Data Protection Committee. This says constitute the Data Governance and Data Protection Committee under the chairmanship of a board member, preferably an independent director. The designated DPO compliance officer serves as secretary to this committee, and it includes representation of all key stakeholders, such as the CEO, CFO, CMO, CTO, CISO, and the chiefs of legal and HR, as well as the PSO. The third implementation specification is external independent data auditor Since the hospital is a significant data fiduciary, you need to appoint an external independent data auditor with necessary credentials. What is necessary credentials? That you separately check. In fact, FDPPI is creating exclusively trained persons under the Certified Independent Data Auditor program. Now, implementation specification 4 is regarding the process inventory. It is necessary, this is a basic principle of DGPSI, that the activities of an organization is actually broken up into multiple processes, each process representing a purpose, and create a inventory of such processes. So it is necessary under this implementation specification to identify every purpose for which personal data is used in digital form, recognize a process associated with each such process, then create an inventory of such processes, and treating AI processes as an independent process. Then we need to assign a specific process owner to each process who is responsible for compliance within that process. This actually goes with the distributed responsibility principle also. Now manage each process as a separate unit with exclusive DPDPA requirements, data minimization, retention, access, etc., integrated with the enterprise policies, but basically synced with the purpose for which a particular process processes the information. Use data recognized by each process owner to build a consolidated data inventory with appropriate classifications. Tailor organizational oversight to the sensitivity of the purpose. That is, when we say that we need to create an inventory of data, that inventory of data is pulled from the inventory from each of the processes. Okay. And the central inventory will have its own specific ID and so on. Properly segregate processes using DPDPA protected data from other personal data and non-personal data processes. We sometimes use this terminology of DPDPA protected data to distinguish the personal data which comes under the DPDPA as distinct from the GDPR related personal data or non-personal data. The fifth implementation specification is about the risk assessment. So the management has a responsibility to cause the conduct of a DPDPA risk assessment by an independent data auditor. Develop a document that defines the scope of the DPDPA compliance implementation program. Now, we have been debating on who has to conduct this risk assessment. Of course, the DGPSI generally suggests that based on the model implementation specifications, one has to do the risk assessment and then present it to the management. Management will take a view based on the capacity to absorb risk and then decide whether the gaps identified in the risk assessment has to be mitigated, and if so, how, or if not, why. Okay, so the management takes the responsibility for determining the conversion of the gap assessment created by the risk assessment team to an implementation charter. Okay, now should that decision lie entirely with the management, or should that scope of implementation be decided by another independent data auditor is a matter to be discussed in detail. Perhaps one of the best practices is that instead of the management deciding what should be the scope of the implementation, the independent data auditor who has not done the risk assessment may be asked to use that risk assessment and come up with a compliance charter, which the management has to administratively adapt and pass it on to the data protection officer. So this is the risk assessment aspect. Then we come to the creation of awareness and acceptance, ensure all employees, consultants, vendors receive appropriate awareness, supplement awareness with acceptance through appropriate ethical assurance, covering everyone exposed to the organization's personal data. Then There is also a need to create an exception policy, establishing exception handling systems with adequate checks and balances and appropriate documentation. Because we are dealing with life and death, tomorrow we should not run into a situation where we are restricted by the policies while the life is at risk. Okay, so exception policies have to be there in every organization, more so in a hospital. Ensure business continuity and patient safety are not compromised. That will be the basic objective of this exception policy. Then, as far as the data valuation is concerned, it's a general principle which we have adopted in the DGPSI. Here, of course, it remains, but it is subordinated to life. So, establish a policy to recognize the financial value of the data and assign a notional financial value for each data set because that is required for governance aspects. Bring visibility of the value to the personal data assets to relevant stakeholders. The financial value of the data shall not, however, override its value as a representation of human life. Data monetization shall be strictly regulated. The ninth implementation specification is that the compliance runs across the business life cycle, and therefore the policy has to be established for identifying and factoring in the impact at all levels of business operations, not necessarily at the IT level, not necessarily at the privacy department, but the entire level. Then coverage begins with the marketing of new business and continues through the entire data processing life cycle. 10th implementation specification is regarding third-party processing contracts. Establish a policy for using third-party contractors for data processing with enforceable contracts carrying appropriate data protection assurances. Contracts should enable audits, indemnities, cover all personal data services, manpower outsourcing, cloud or shared hosting of website, email, application development, and sharing of research or societal obligations. All contract employees, consultants, and outsourced personnel with access to personal data act under the organization's authority bound by written confidentiality, security, and data protection obligations. Where a consultant is independently or jointly determining the purpose and means of processing, he should be treated as a joint data fiduciary. Now, 11th implementation specification is regulator relationship management. With the management should ideally establish a system for establishing a relationship and monitoring the relations with the regulatory agencies, which may be Data Protection Board, which may be CERT-in, or other sectoral or jurisdictional regulators. It may be the NABH authorities, it may be other local authorities. Need to know data sharing is the 12th implementation specification. That is, you need to have policies ensuring that sharing of personal data by employees and consultants is strictly on need-to-know basis. Subject all sharing of data minimization requirements and to data minimization requirements and non-disclosure agreements. 13th specification is about security. Establish a policy for maintaining digital presence on web, mobile, wearables, IoT, etc. Provide adequate security against misuse under applicable data protection laws, including intellectual property and cybercrime laws. 14th implementation specification is about establishing a suitable system for monitoring devices which process personal data and provide automated outputs, some of which may fall under the AI category, some of which may not fully fall in the category of AI, but they may be taking automated decisions, so they also have to be taken note of. Ensure the integrity of these outputs. Now, there has to be a AI usage policy. Develop and implement AI usage policy covering all software algorithms, models, in-house and external, generative AI, agentic AI. Hello, friends. We had discussed the responsibilities of the management under the DGPSI-Hospital framework. Now, we will go into the 13 specifications which we associate with the DPO responsibilities. The first in such responsibilities, the 16th in the overall 50 implementation specifications, is that the DPO should establish data processing policies for each process where DPDPA applicable personal data is processed. It has to cover the necessity for the particular process, the requirements, the notice requirements, legal basis, and other relevant information specific to that particular process. Incorporate the personal purpose limitation, data minimization, retention minimization, data quality, the need to know access in each policy, and hold the process owner accountable. Now, when we say need to know, has to be need to know access has to be specific to the process. We are saying that even if the organization has got a data set of one data principle having several parameters, not all parameters need to be associated with a given process. So each process and the users of that process should have access only to the specific data elements relevant to that process. So the data inventory will have a row which is referring to one particular data principle with a particular ID, and against which there are 20-30 parameters, but not all the 20-30 parameters are required to be available to all the process owners. So this aspect needs to be taken note of. Then incorporate purpose limitation, data minimization, retention minimization, data accuracy, need to know access in each policy. Hold the process owner accountable for that. No process shall occur that is not covered by exemption or legitimate use or specific consent. So make external data processors responsible for DPDPA compliance of their processes with necessary commitment on record. Then the 17th implementation specification is that the organization shall establish a policy for continuing use of legacy personal data and of data after the end of its original purpose, including sending notice, monitoring the return of the permission, documenting the responses, and following up. Where continued processing is not justified, commit the data to anonymized archival or destruction. Where continuation is justified on a legitimate basis, create secured archives with elevated security for processing in the absence of consents. Now, 18th implementation specification refers to the consent-based processing. So establish policies for processing the data coming under the DPDPA under valid consent, have adequate notice, monitor, document, and follow. Establish separate policies for different channels of interaction, such as web or mobile or IoT. Authenticate all consents and modifications and preserve them with unique tracking ID for the period required under law. MIS 19 is establishing a policy and system for managing relationships with consent managers who are likely to be registered by the DPB in due course. MIS 20 is to handle the unstructured personal data, a separate policy of how that has to be handled. Should cover discovery, merging with structured collections of personal data, and erasure in unstructured form. MIS 21 is establishing a policy for the data principal rights management, which should cover the data access. It includes the right to correction and deletion, and also keep the requirement consistent with the ITA 2000 compliance and patient safety regulations. Other rights such as nomination and grievance will fall under the responsibilities of the legal department. Now, MIS 22 is about the incident management. So establish a policy for incident management in the privacy context where incident identification validation is related to the DPDPA and not to any other ISMS system. Keep the policy consistent with the requirements of the NABH and, of course, ITA 2000. Now, establish a policy for timely recognition and notification of data breaches to all stakeholders, because here we are having a data breach notification going to the CERTIN, also to the DPB and NABH authorities, include immediate measures for prevention and detection of privacy incidents. MIS 24 relates to disclosure and destruction. Adopt appropriate policy for disclosure and destruction of personal data as per applicable laws. MIS 25 is establish a policy for implementing security at physical level, logical level, application and data access levels. Cover assets located in organizational resources also with the data processors, cloud operators, or with employees. Now, trusted asset lifecycle is the 26th MIS. Establish a policy for acquisition, disposal, sharing, or licensing of hardware and software assets, right from the purchase to disposal. Source only from reliable and verified suppliers with assurance of security. The 27th implementation specification is regarding documentation. Ensure appropriate documentation because that is a requirement of the compliance. Then 28th implementation specification is about establishing appropriate internal audit measures, facilitating external audit whenever required. In the case of AI, supporting the data protection impact assessment with annual external data auditors evaluation at least once a year as required under DPDPA. So these are the requirements of the DPO responsibilities under DGPSI-Hospital. Let us take a break now before we go into the legal responsibilities and HR responsibilities and the technology responsibilities in the subsequent modules. Hello, friends. We shall continue our discussions on the DGPSI-Hospital, particularly with reference to the responsibilities which we identify as part of the legal team. There are 6 specifications which we identify here. The first one, of course, is the grievance redressal, which is part of the data principles rights management. Establish appropriate policies for grievance redressal. We should cover DPDPA as well as ITA 2000 and NABH regulations. It should cover not only the complaints handling at the technical help center level, the next DPO level. Then if something is not resolved at the DPO level, try to establish an ombudsman, and if not, go to say the mediation, so that before the complaining data principal goes to the data protection board, there is sufficient opportunity to completely redress his grievance. Nomination facility is also part of the rights management. It has been placed under the legal responsibility because of the complexities involved in establishing the nomination policy, which includes registration of nomination at the time of collection of personal information, then subsequently recognizing the contingent event of the death of the particular person, and then identifying who are the legal heirs, who are the nominees, and settling any disputes between them before disposing of the nominated data. All this has got its own legal complications, so let the legal department take the responsibility for that. Similarly, handling minors Data and guardian's consent is also something which it is preferable for the legal department to take responsibility for. Then we have the business associate contracts, which needs to be drafted, covering data protection requirements. Ensure that there is a proper updating of the requirements, identification of inter-se responsibilities, who are the persons responsible for management of the contract, when is it expiring, etc. Then we have this medical equipment vendor contracts, which may require a special consideration because medical devices suppliers may have certain embedded say software, so the device itself needs to be properly covered. All the performances of the device has to be covered, and the only way it can perhaps be covered is through an appropriate contract. Similarly, contracts with clinical and service partners, establish policies for structuring the contracts with consulting doctors, external diagnostic centers, external medical service providers, including food and other supplies, to ensure DPDPA compliance. Next, we'll continue with the HR responsibilities, under which 5 specifications are mentioned. The first one is employee inventory and training. Maintain an inventory of employees with relevant policy for assigning responsibility under distributed responsibility. Then provide privacy awareness training on a periodic basis. Then establish a privacy policy for processing personal data of employees separately from the privacy policy for public, because there are some specific complications involved in handling the HR of employees. So you have to take care of the recruitment, the case of ex-employees, and those on manpower supply contracts, if any, as per applicable laws. Now execute separate privacy policies with consulting doctors, because they are mostly in the scope of a joint data fiduciary. Then it is HR's responsibility to create a compliance culture. So there is an implementation specifications highlighting the need to establish an augmented HR policy for developing a compliance culture in the organization, which includes imposition of duties, sanctions, and providing incentives also. Then there has to be a whistleblower policy as a support to the incident management policy. Establish a whistleblower policy covering employees and extending it to external participants, including the public. Provide appropriate witness protection and incentives. Then 39 is acceptable use of resources. Establish an accepted usage policy for resources allocated by the organization. Cover working from locations outside the office and use of own devices with relevant sanctions for violation. Lastly, we have 10 specifications assigned to the technology department, which of course is quite familiar to most of you. The first thing is the process inventory to be created with unique IDs. We have already discussed the process inventory during the management responsibilities. So this is an inventory of processes that generate, use, disclose, or destroy personal data. Each process should have a unique process ID. It should be tagged with a purpose, and you should also tag the contextual role of the organization for each process, such as whether the organization is a data fiduciary for this particular process or data processor, etc. Now identify a process owner for each process. He will be like an internal data controller and is responsible for compliance within their area of operation. Now identify each process input data, output data, nature of processing, storage status, movement of data during processing and storage. Essentially, each process is like an enterprise by itself. Adopt a dynamic access permissions on a need-to-know basis. tag restrictions on rights to use as per contractual permissions covering data protection laws, IPR laws, sectoral regulations, etc. The next implementation specification is creating the personal data inventory. Create an inventory of personal data as data sets under a unique master data management scheme with necessary attributes, including the source of the data and the legal basis for collection. Each data set of an individual who is the data principal should have a unique ID against which several parameters are associated. Different sets of these parameters are associated with different processes. All this has to be captured in this inventory. Associate each personal data set with classification attributes such as minor, employee, sensitive, and applicable jurisdiction if it is GDPR or something like that. Establish a technology architecture that inventories personal data identifiers and runs continuous search for periodic updating. So what is meant by this implementation specification is that not in all cases we have a structured collection of personal data of one single patient in one single occasion. So sometimes the hospital will have personal data elements floating around without being able to be identified with a specific identified person. Therefore, you need a system where the technology architecture should collect the data personal data identifiers, and then periodically by running some kind of an aggregation software, identify the individual data principal, then associate the attributes to that particular person before it is taken to the master data inventory. Now identify a unique core ID associated with the MDM ID and establish a system for populating other personal data attributes on an ongoing basis. Pseudonymization and masking is an important implementation specification. Set up a policy for that and ensure that there is a secured disclosure of personal data in between processes or for external disclosure. Then centralized personal data store is recommended. Establish a centralized personal data store, establish a secure remote access architecture for virtual processing. If you feel security will get compromised by centralization, have a distributed access control system, but let there not be multiple instances of personal data floating around within the organization. Implementation specification 44 is about information security controls. Establish information security controls to prevent unauthorized access, modification, denial of personal data, and to counter data leakage and exfiltration. Include a policy of encryption in storage, transit, and processing, along with the required key management system. Include data integrity management and non-repudiable authentication of data using appropriate techno-legal tools. Also include system updating, malware protection, and related hygiene. MIS 45 is management of cross-border data transit. Establish a policy for handling transit of data across jurisdictional borders. Comply with applicable law, including sectoral laws. Now, 46 is disaster recovery and business continuity. Establish a policy for disaster recovery and business continuity to meet the requirements during exigencies. Include escrow of encryption keys, critical software code as appropriate. 47 is jurisdictional segregation, establishing a policy adopting technical measures to segregate processing of personal data of different jurisdictions if it is required. Maintain arm's length relationship between the service units belonging to different jurisdictions, maybe GDPR or some other jurisdiction. 48 is about AI explainability document. Collect an authenticated explainability document from developer as part of the licensing contract. In case it is developed in-house, then that team will have to develop the explainability document. The document indicates how the AI functions in processing personal data and the likely harm it may cause to the data principal. You also have to get a licenser's security assurance for AI, collect a documented assurance from the licensor that the AI software is adequately tested for vulnerabilities at their end, preferably by a third-party auditor. The document should state when deployed for data processing, the AI software is reasonably secured against vulnerabilities that may adversely affect the confidentiality, integrity, availability of data, and the privacy principles where the personally identifiable data is processed. Sufficient guardrails must exist to protect the data principals whose data may be processed by the deployer. The last implementation specification is the deployer's duties. AI shall not harm society. Take all measures essential to ensure that AI does not harm society at large. Obtain documented assurances from the licensor in particular. That the AI comes with a tamper-proof kill switch. For humanoid and industrial robots, the kill switch is controlled separately from the intelligence imported to the device. So device intelligence cannot take over the kill switch. Where the device attempts to access the kill switch without human intervention, a self-destruction instruction shall be built in. Cyborgs and sentient algorithms are a risk to the society. Classify them as critical risk, regulated more strictly than other AI with express approval at the highest management level of the data fiduciary. Impart time-sensitive weightage to data used for learning and future decisions with a fading memory parameter assigned to the age of the observation. Ensure sufficient disclosures to data principals about the AI risk. These are the 50 implementation specifications which are included in the DGPSI-Hospital. Hope this will give a structure for the hospitals to implement DPDPA. And if you have any questions on this, please feel free to write to me. We will try to clarify them to the best of our ability. And also, if there is a need to improve upon these things, we will try to do so. Thank you.